We are live on Facebook. It's Sunday, October the 6th. This is the online Gurdjieff group. My name is Allan. Today we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about suffering and the relationship of suffering to these teachings and to our evolution and development. It's a very, very important topic. The understanding of the necessity to suffer consciously, not unconscious mechanical suffering, but conscious suffering. It is one of the most transformative acts that we can do, one of the most transformative elements in the world. So, for instance, the Buddha, life is suffering, and so he developed the Eightfold Path to help his students overcome suffering. It's something, a concept, an idea that Mr. Gurdjieff fundamentally disagrees with. Within Buddhism, the way to enlightenment is to become a monk and retreat into a monastery and just control external conditions so much that you're not disturbed, you're not upset, you don't get inflamed. So they hide away from the world, they flee from the world to avoid suffering, whereas Mr. Gurdjieff says we should confront suffering. But I'll get more into that a little bit later. Hisham, how are you? How are things in Morocco?
Well, everything's fine for me. I feel peaceful this week. I feel really peaceful.
Okay. How's the inner work going? I know that you were opening doors with one hand and closing them with the other, and
yes, well, I kept up with this exercise. It's only that I shifted the order now this week.
Okay.
I shifted the order, so I shift the order every week.
Yeah.
Every week I do it in the other order.
Yeah. How's it going?
Well, it is going great. Sometimes I forget about it, but then I have that instant where I make the right move, the movement.
Yeah.
So sometimes I have to stop to think which hand or which feet I have to use. So that gives me a chance to be present.
I mean, maybe in a future show, not too long from now, I will review the decision exercise. It's a wonderful exercise, but part of the decision exercise involves putting yourself into a very quiet state, a very meditative state, and then asking your deeper, higher, inward self if a specific task is appropriate. And then if you get the correct response and it is appropriate, another important element of the decision exercise is setting some form of punishment if you fail to achieve what you decided or intended to do. Do you have anything like that, Hisham, or is it going pretty good? What do you do when you notice that you didn't do it? Do you do anything?
Well, in the past, I used to suffer vainly when I schedule something and I don't do it. I just suffer vainly without value, futile suffering. But then that it was a part of my exercise to shift the thinking. So what I do now is that when I forget something, I am compassionate with myself. I know I forget it. I memorize it. I say next time I must do my best to not forget. And every time I see improvements.
Okay. If it works, it works. Karen, how are things in Mexico?
Things are very bad. This town is taken over by criminals. There's murders every day. It's very upsetting. It doesn't really affect my particular life because it's them on them, but it's put a pall on the whole town, and everybody's insecurity is coming out. So what can I say? It's not a good time here in Mexico. Chaos.
Yeah. How big is your town?
Oh, it's over 100,000 now.
Okay. Mr. Gurdjieff said that in times of war, in times of mass hysteria, in situations such as where you're living, most people get so caught up in it that it sort of frees up a little bit of more energy. Energy is probably the wrong word, but for those people who are on the path, it gives them an opportunity. It provides more of an opportunity to grow. Everyone is sort of like lemmings leaning one way, and it allows us to move the other direction. Have you noticed anything like that? Does this add to your ability to work, your ability to self-remember, be present here and now in this moment?
No, I don't think it does, Alan. It's fairly remote from me, although it's present every day in the town. I don't go out that much, and I don't feel threatened by it. So no. But
what about, because you actually meet with a live group on a weekly basis as well. Has it changed the group at all? Has it? No.
No, it's just an undercurrent of insecurity because it doesn't happen to people here who are minding their own business. It's a criminal on criminal thing, but it's just become so blatant that, for instance, last weekend, a head was found in a cooler under a bridge. And then at the funeral of the guy whose head was in the cooler, two other people were killed in the back of a truck who were related to that guy. So it's barbaric. That's all I can say. But I don't get interested in it in any other way than just the tragedy of it for the people who lose their people.
Yeah. I know that when Mr. Gurdjieff was youth, part of the Seekers of Truth, there were places that he went where he said if they saw you, they would shoot you on sight. Particularly if you didn't belong, particularly if you really looked differently. So it's like we're kind of reverting back to that and to a state of lawlessness and the power of the bullet.
Here it is totally anarchic, and the police are in on it, and the mayor is in on it, and there's just no law enforcement at all, and no justice even when someone's nailed.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you can somehow try to turn this into growing more, the awareness, how it's affecting you, perhaps perceiving within your body where you're noticing the stress tension, rather than allow it to mechanically happen, the adrenaline and the fear and everything, to be conscious of it, at least to suffer consciously, which is what we will be talking about today. Brian, how are you doing?
Very good. As for the inner work, I've been doing the morning sitting from your video on YouTube for a few months, and I've recently started trying to do it without your guidance, which is definitely more tough. I can't go through the whole 22 minutes by myself, but I kind of start it, and then the mind wanders, I kind of bring it back, but that's what I'm working on right now.
With myself, I find that when I listen to the recording, it takes 22 minutes. Mm-hmm. When I don't listen to the recording, I can do it in close to 10 minutes. Because I can quickly, rather than narrating, the shoulder, right upper arm, I can just bring my awareness down wordlessly through all my fingers, back up, then the next limb, and the next limb, and the next limb, and do it much quicker because it's not paced, it's not timed by a voice. Now, ultimately, the goal of all of these self-sensing dimensions of any exercise, as I've mentioned many times, is to be able to develop the sensation of self. to develop this awareness of ourself, the sort of multitude of different awarenesses, gravity, temperature, internal sensations, our bodily sensations, a touch of clothing, air, to really develop our organic self, or the awareness of our organic self. And so there should be a point where you no longer need those training wheels. You know, the right arm, right leg, left arm, within that exercise, that is probably the most important part, because there are other later exercises that involve an awareness of our limbs. William Nyland talks about how if you become aware of your right arm, right leg, left arm, and you circle around, it kind of creates, he didn't use the word, but like a vortex of energy around the solar plexus, which allows us to receive higher impressions. And Mr. Gurdjieff also gave an exercise towards the end of his life of connecting with prayers that people have made. And he said, you know, perhaps focus on Jesus over Jerusalem, Muhammad over Mecca, the Buddha over India, and Saint Lama over Tibet. And we connect to them with our hands and fingers and bring those prayers or the energy of those prayers into our body through our forelimbs, through our hands, and through our feet. So within the self-sensing, within the awareness of our fingers and our toes is very important. But so this is a goal you should be working towards, to try, as you're sitting there now, to be aware of your entire organic self. To be aware from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head, side to side, front to back. If you want to go a little bit further into it, the awareness of your limbs, the awareness of your hands and fingers as well. If you want to move right arm, right leg, left arm, and circle around a bit while remaining aware of your whole body. But when you do it enough and you get practiced enough, you don't really need the training wheels. Then the thing to do is to do it on your own. Back in Mr. Gurdjieff's day, there were no recordings. YouTube didn't exist. People would write down very specifically the instructions that he gave. They would practice it and practice it and practice it reading, and then eventually they would no longer need to read the elaborate instructions, and they would be doing it. And so we're kind of lucky, but it also makes us lazy in the fact that we can just press play and allow ourselves to be narrated through this. So try to work on that. I know that when you do your rowing and, you know, the stuff like that, you really get into your body. You know, try to come back to your body as often as you can with the awareness of your hands, fingers, limbs, legs, feet, toes. So you don't need to listen to the exercise. And the other thing about that exercise, the morning sitting, and I've mentioned this before, it's really about breathing in the higher particles in the air that Mr. Gurdjieff talked about. Within any alchemical process, the higher must blend with the lower to meet in the middle. So for instance, the energy that the body naturally produces, the highest energy is C12, and C12 meets with So48 to become La 24. La 24, we can experience La 24 simply by becoming mindful of our hands. When we're mindful of our body, when we have that sensation of self, when we're aware of the organic, our body is one organic whole, that awareness is fueled by La 12, or La 24, and it requires C12. But we don't have the corresponding So 12 within us to allow the octave of air to properly develop. There is no higher to come into contact with the lower to meet in the middle. And this exercise, the morning sitting, the breathing, the development of feeling, actually brings that higher element into ourselves so that we can begin then to work on our emotions. So it's a very important exercise. The self-sensing is really to develop the awareness of that one brain, and then the breathing in particles of light and whatever, the head brain, and then the awareness of that effervescent, shimmering atmospheric quality, the feeling brain, to turn it into a three-brained exercise and be aware of our breathing. But if you've listened to it for a few months, you should be able to do it now without listening to it. And you should be able to do it a little bit more quickly. Sitting in your car, when you're on a park bench, when you're having lunch, wherever you have the presence of mind to do so. But the real key of that exercise is the breathing, the three brains, the consciously breathing and becoming aware of feeling as opposed to sensing and thinking. Because we're breathing in that higher molecule that then meets with the lower so that we can evolve in the octave of air. So I know you do that a lot without, conscious or without realizing, with the exercising and the rowing and stuff like that, getting into your body. So try to start doing the morning sitting. The three brains, especially the sensation of the body without a recording, the breathing, recognizing that you are breathing in those higher particles necessary for that alchemical reaction to take place within you along the octave of air and begin the transformation of your emotions. Okay, let me just do my normal, what we're doing this work for, we're doing this work for ourselves, for mankind, and for the earth herself. Mr. Gurdjieff's vow: I wish to be, I can be, I have the right to be, I have the ability to be, I swear to myself that this will never be for my personal profit, but to help others. I wish to be to help others. It's very important to recognize that whenever we do any kind of inner work, that we're not just doing it for ourselves, that it affects our fellow human beings, and it also affects the earth. Our body comes from the earth. So when we work, we are in our body, and the effect on our body then has an effect on the earth. Our essence is human essence. It belongs to humanity collectively. So whenever we work on ourselves, we are also working on our essence and affecting our essence. So it also affects humanity. And it's important to realize this, to know that this is not a selfish act. It's not like we don't like existence and we want to achieve liberation or moksha, as in the world-denying religions where they want to extinguish the self. We want to transform higher and higher energies within ourselves. And by transforming higher energies, we serve a higher purpose. So let's just begin by relaxing the body. Mr. Gurdjieff said that relaxation should start from the head and to go down. And he also said that relaxation was a prerequisite, a requirement to do inner work. If you're tense, if your body's holding on to tension, that's a form of physical identification. And it's necessary to just let go and relax the body. So just bring your attention to the top of your head and just relax the crown of your head. And then slowly moving down, sort of like an egg coming down the head, or like water slowly coming down. Bring this relaxation down into your forehead and the occipital muscle in the very back of your head. And then bring it down your eyebrows, the muscles in the sides of your head, the back of your head, bringing it down, relaxing your eyes, your ears, the various muscles on that level, bringing it down, relaxing your mouth, your cheeks, your jaw, the top back part of your neck, bringing it right down, relaxing your whole head, then relaxing the top of your neck, moving it down to the bottom of your neck, then relaxing your shoulders, relaxing your upper torso, so your chest, upper arms, upper back, relaxing your midriff, your solar plexus, middle back, elbows, relaxing your lower torso, lower arms, abdomen, lower back, moving down into your buttocks, relaxing the gluteus maximus, the biggest muscle in the body, your buttocks, your pelvis, your hips, moving down, relaxing your upper legs, down, relaxing your knees, down, relaxing your lower legs, your ankles, your feet, right down to the bottom of your feet. Relax your whole body from the top of your head down to the bottom of your feet. And following your own natural rhythm of breath, breathe in to the top of your head, and then as you breathe out, send a wave of relaxation down your body to the bottom of your feet. Following your own natural breath, breathing in to the top of your head, and then relaxing your body all the way down to the bottom of your feet as you breathe out. And let's just do it one more time. Breathing into the top of your head, and then just sending a warm and gentle wave of relaxation all the way down to the bottom of your feet. And scan your body. Become aware if perhaps somewhere within your body there's some kind of a residual of tension, some place that's not fully relaxed, and just use your breath. Breathe into that area, and as you breathe out, consciously relax that area, consciously relaxing your whole body. And then we're going to do Mr. Gurdjieff's filling exercise. As a vessel fills with warm golden honey, slowly from the very soles of your feet, begin to fill with sensation. So right now, just focus your awareness as completely as you can on the soles of your feet, sensing the bottom of your feet, and then slowly fill your feet with sensation. And then fill with sensation up through your ankles, up through your lower legs, up to your knees, up through your thighs, to your hips, buttocks, now including your hands, filling with sensation up through the lower part of your torso, your wrists, your lower arms, up to your midriff, middle back, solar plexus, elbows, up through your upper back, shoulder blades, chest, upper arms to your shoulders, and then filling with sensation up through your neck, and then slowly filling with sensation up through your head to the top of your head. Sensing your body as one organic whole. Sensing your whole body from the bottom of your feet to the top of your head. From front to back, side to side, inside out, outside in. Developing what Mr. Gurdjieff called the sensation of self. And what I like to refer to as the awareness of our organic body as one whole. This organic awareness of our organic self. Aware of your body. Aware of your body breathing. Aware of gravity, the temperature of the room and the air touching your skin, the atmospheric pressure of the room. Aware of the inside your body, your bones, your stomach, your lungs expanding and contracting, aware of the touch of clothing on your skin, perhaps socks on your feet, the touch of clothing on your legs, on your torso, the awareness perhaps of any jewelry, aware of your body, and bring your awareness into your hands and fingers, feet and toes, while remaining aware of your body. Understand that when we do those exercises where we move through each finger, each toe separately, that there's a reason for this. So try to develop this general awareness of your body, sensing your body as one organic whole, aware of your breathing, aware of the muscles involved in breathing, the sensation of breathing, aware of your whole body breathing. And as I've said many times, this is the preliminary and awareness we have to develop. And as a result, it is the most important, because if we fail to do this, if we don't learn how to develop the sensation of self, we can't really begin to engage in the other higher forms of inner work. So hold on to this awareness of your body, sensing your body. Become aware of the difference in the weave of the cloth, say perhaps between the cloth that you can feel touching your legs and perhaps your torso and your arms. Really try to sense your body as fully as you can. And then let's finish with the collected state exercise. As the earth is surrounded by an atmosphere, so too are we surrounded by an atmosphere. Normally our atmosphere is dispersed, it's pulled away. If we think about something, our atmosphere goes in that direction. If we're identified with something, our atmosphere goes to what we are identified with. So collect your atmosphere. Draw it back around you, perhaps a meter, meter and a half. Become aware of the boundary of your atmosphere. Sense the border of your atmosphere. Become aware of it. And now we can disturb our atmosphere through our thoughts, through our sensations, and through our feelings. So keep your mind still. Keep your body comfortable, calm, relaxed. Keep your feelings tranquil. Keep your atmosphere still, quiet, calm, contained, perhaps a meter, meter and a half around you. And in a moment, I'm going to count from 1 to 3. And when I get to 3, breathe your atmosphere in. And as you breathe out, imagine that some of the emanations that were in your atmosphere remain and settle within you. 1, 2, 3. Breathe your atmosphere in. And then as you breathe out, imagine something remains. And then let's finish with Mr. Gurdjieff's affirmation. Quietly in your mind, repeat after me. May results from this exercise be transubstantiated within me for my being. And then slowly come back. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook now, or who are watching later on YouTube, on Facebook, you'll notice above that I put a bit of a description of what we're going to be talking about today, suffering, and then I added a couple of links. One is to a series of inner exercises that I have on YouTube. Some of these inner exercises go much deeper into various things. The most important one is the morning sitting, but there are various other inner exercises there. Check them out. Doesn't matter what we know up here in terms of the philosophy, in terms of the theory. We only grow through practice, through the inner work. For those watching on YouTube, there will be a description just below, and there will be links to the inner exercises. Both on Facebook and both on YouTube, there are also links where you can download a PDF copy of In Search of the Miraculous. I believe that's the most important book on the teachings. It was written by P.D. Uspensky. There are problems and limitations with that book, but you won't notice them if you're new to these teachings. A corollary is Views from the Real World, which was compiled by Madame de Salzmann after Mr. Gurdjieff died. And I believe those books should be read in conjunction. You should read In Search of the Miraculous and then read Views from the Real World. And that will help balance your understanding of these teachings. So today I'm going to talk about suffering. And as I mentioned, within Buddhism, for instance, the Buddha said life is suffering. And the way to break free from suffering is to follow the Eightfold Path. The way to break free from suffering is to flee the world where there's a lot of torment, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of misery, to go to a monastery and have today like yesterday, like tomorrow, to try and get into a very quiet existence where there's no friction, there's just peace and tranquility. And Mr. Gurdjieff strongly disagreed with this. We now know that all of the Buddhist scriptures, for instance, the texts that have been attributed to the Buddha, were written down at least 400 years after the death of the Buddha. So in a sense, we don't really know what the Buddha originally said. However, in Beelzebub Tales to His Grandson, Mr. Gurdjieff talks about in that, through the fictional voice of Beelzebub, a fallen angel who got banished to our solar system. He puts in the Buddha's mouth that one of the best ways to work on ourselves, I'm not phrasing it properly because it would require too much explanation, is to be able to tolerate the displeasing manifestations of others towards ourselves. So rather than flee the world, rather than flee that nasty neighbor, rather than flee irritable and irritating people, to lead a life of peace and tranquility, we should be rubbing our noses in it. This is suffering. But there's a difference between mechanical suffering and conscious suffering. Now, this topic arose last week before we went on Facebook and live. I was briefly talking to Hisham and talking about voluntary suffering. And a lot of times you will find the word voluntary suffering. For instance, In Search of the Miraculous. That was compiled by P.D. Uspensky from notes that he took after meetings with Mr. Gurdjieff. Mr. Gurdjieff wouldn't allow him to take notes during the meetings, but he had some kind of, not a photographic memory, it wasn't a photograph, it was more like a phonographic memory. He could remember phrases, he could remember what people said, and immediately after he would write them down. And that book arose because Mr. Gurdjieff ordered him to write it. He knew what the notes were. Mr. Gurdjieff had access to the notes. He knew what Uspensky had written. Those notes were shared among students in Russia, but they were in Russian. And Mr. Gurdjieff had no hand in writing or editing the manuscript of In Search of the Miraculous. However, he did verify its authenticity. Anything in quotes, he verified. In fact, he used to have chapters of it read during his meetings towards the end of his life. So the other thing is, Uspensky was fluent in English. When he fled Russia, he lived in England. He developed a school in England, and during the war, he went to America. And so Uspensky translated that book into English. Uspensky did not hire a translator. He didn't give it to someone and then they hand him back this book in a strange language. He translated it. And so in that book, he uses the word voluntary. And the same problem arises in views from the real world. After he died, Madame de Salzman asked all of his students to send her their notes of talks and lectures and things that Mr. Gurdjieff had said to them. And a lot of it was in Russian. Back when those notes were compiled, it was before Mr. Gurdjieff had moved to the West, before he began to understand English and whatever. But those notes were compiled after his death, and then they were translated by translators after his death. And so you will find that there is very little mention of intentional suffering. They translate it as voluntary suffering. Now, when Mr. Gurdjieff was writing his first draft of Beelzebub Tales to his grandson, helping him with the English translation was perhaps the finest editor of the English language of his day, Alfred Orage, or A.R. Orage. A.R. Orage was the editor of a literary magazine called The New Age. He was personally good friends with George Bernard Shaw and all sorts of people. And so you would think that A.R. Orage would understand English and the nuances of English better than Mr. Gurdjieff. And they argued for hours over this single word. Orage said voluntary suffering, while Mr. Gurdjieff maintained no, intentional suffering. Mr. Gurdjieff also said that philology, which is the study of language, what we call linguistics, is more important than philosophy. And I'm fortunate, my ex-wife was a linguist, so I like to joke that I have a BA in linguistics from the University of Osmosis, 20 years of sitting around the kitchen table, hearing her talk about linguistics, hearing her graduate students and at parties and everything talk about linguistics. There's something that occurs in language which is called nominalizing or nominalization. Voluntary and intentional are nominalizations. They're taking a verb and nominalizing it, turning it into something that can be used in the position of a noun or a noun phrase. Whenever a verb is nominalized, meaning is stripped from it. The verb is much more explicit. The noun phrase derived from the verb is much more nebulous. This is one of the techniques that people who study Ericksonian hypnosis are taught, to really step on nominalizations, because unlike the verb that they were derived from, it allows for a wider interpretation by a person's subconscious mind. So voluntary comes from to volunteer. Intentional comes from the verb in the finite form to intend. And there is a very subtle but pronounced difference between volunteering or to volunteer to suffer and to intend to suffer. I can volunteer for a fire department and never, ever put out a fire. Volunteering doesn't mean that it happens. Intentional suffering is to go out and intentionally suffer, to put ourselves in situations where we suffer. We suffer with full awareness. When I was 16 years old, I had an accident. I tripped. I fell flat on my face, or not on my face. I hit concrete with my jaw. Just boom. That wasn't an accident. What happened was I passed out. Standing up, concrete. I hit the concrete, smashed. I stuck my finger in my mouth, and I thought, where did this sand come from? Over half of my teeth were broken in that event. I went to the dentist. The dentist said, there's nothing I can do. We've got to wait for these nerves to die. I eventually had caps and all sorts of things. But for close to or around 2 years, I was in a constant state of pain. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was one of the most important things that ever happened to me, because I didn't wallow in the pain. I somehow learned to suffer consciously. I didn't think, oh, poor me, why did this happen to me? Oh, the world, oh, this and that. I just, this is what is, this is the pain, accept it. And at later times in my life, late 20s, early 30s, I suffered mechanically for various things. I wallowed, self-pity, all sorts of stuff. But somehow, for that 2-year period associated with that pain, I didn't wallow in it. And I realized years later how important that experience was for my own inner development. Now, as I said, I wallowed in self-pity. I had pity parties about other things later in my life. But for that pain, for that sustained period, I just accepted it. And there was an element of conscious awareness of it, not letting myself get caught up in the pity and, oh, woe is me. And there's a big difference between mechanical suffering and conscious suffering. I'm now going to share my screen with, whoops, just a second. It's not sharing my screen. With quotes from Mr. Gurdjieff. Question: what is the role of suffering in self-development? Answer: there are 2 kinds of suffering, conscious and unconscious. Only a fool suffers unconsciously. Basically, most of us are fools. In life, there are 2 rivers, 2 directions. In the first, the law is for the river itself, not the drops of water. We are drops. At one moment, a drop is at the surface. At another moment, at the bottom. Suffering depends on its position. In the first river, suffering is completely useless because it is accidental and unconscious. So accidental as opposed to intentional. And accidental, the opposite of accidental isn't voluntary, it's intentional. So accidental and unconscious. And the opposite of unconscious is conscious. And here, mindful, to be mindful, to be aware, mindfully aware of our sufferings. So our suffering can be accidental and unconscious, or it can be intentional and conscious. Parallel with this river is another river. In this other river, there is a different kind of suffering. The drop in the first river has the possibility of passing into the second. And here, this is an aside, this happens when the magnetic center starts to work and we step onto the mystical path. If you are on the mystical path, you have somehow crossed from one river to the other. Today, the drop suffers because yesterday it did not suffer enough. The drop in the first river has the possibility of passing into the second. Today, the drop suffers because yesterday it did not suffer enough. Here, the law of retribution operates. The drop can also suffer in advance. In other words, we can bring and consciously manipulate the circumstances in our life to increase the suffering. So not just consciously suffering and being mindful of the fact that we are suffering, but to increase our suffering, to make it intentional. So the drop can also suffer in advance. Sooner or later, everything is paid for. For the cosmos, there is no time. Suffering can be voluntary, and here it would be better to translate this word as intentional because the original was in Russian. Suffering can be voluntary, and only voluntary suffering has value. So reading that again, suffering can be intentional, and only intentional suffering has value. One may suffer simply because one feels unhappy, or one may suffer for yesterday to prepare for tomorrow. And in the past, I've done meetings on remorse of conscience, going back into our past, to specific moments in our past, perhaps where we yelled at our parents as an ungrateful ungrateful teenager, or whatever, and reliving the suffering we caused them. So one may suffer for yesterday, that is to repair our past, to use intentional suffering to repair our past, or to prepare for tomorrow. So we can suffer for the things that we did in the past to repair them, or we can suffer today knowing that we are accumulating something and we are helping ourselves in what will happen in the future. I repeat, only voluntary, or better translation, intentional suffering has value. He talked about mechanical suffering is like pouring from the empty to the void. It does absolutely nothing for ourselves. It has a cosmic value, but in terms of our own evolution, in terms of our own development, it doesn't help. Again, suffering can be of two different kinds. To begin with, we shall divide it into two kinds. First, unconscious. Second, conscious. The first kind bears no results. For instance, you suffer from hunger because you have no money to buy bread. If you have some bread and don't eat it and suffer, it is better. So here he's actually giving us a practical example of something that we can do to intentionally increase our suffering by denying ourselves of something that we like. Years ago, when I went on a diet, I tried to do it consciously. This is like 12, 13 years ago. And on the table, right by the door where I'd walk in and out, I left this huge bar of chocolate. And I tried to intentionally suffer every time I saw that chocolate bar, and I thought, oh, I would love that. And no, the denial, creating a degree of friction within myself. Only a conflict between two sides is worth something. Whenever there is an active element, there is a passive element. If you believe in God, you also believe in the devil. All this has no value. Whether you are good or bad, it is not worth anything. Only a conflict between two sides is worth something. Only when much is accumulated can something new manifest itself. At every moment, there may be a conflict in you. You never see yourself. You will believe what I say only when you begin to look into yourself. Then you will see. If you try to do something you don't want to do, you will suffer. If you want to do something and don't do it, you also suffer. So we can suffer by not doing, and we can also suffer by doing. We can suffer by holding ourselves back from doing something we want to do, something we like to do, or we can suffer by making ourselves do things that we don't really want to do, such as to not eat that piece of bread, even though we went and bought the loaf. So those quotes are from Views from the Real World. This one comes from In Search of the Miraculous. Gradually, permanent traits begin to form. Fusion, inner unity, is obtained by means of friction, by the struggle between yes and no in man. If a man lives without inner struggle, if everything happens in him without opposition, if he goes wherever he is drawn or wherever the wind blows, he will remain such as he is. But if a struggle begins in him, and particularly if there is a definite line to this struggle, then gradually permanent traits begin to form in themselves. And here I want to highlight, if there is a definite line in this struggle. So I could walk down the street and trip and become aware of my suffering, become aware of the pain perhaps in my ankle. There is power in that. That can help grow something in me. But it is better if my suffering is intentional, if my suffering is the result of an aim I deliberately set out intending to do. So to deliberately suffer because I left that big chocolate bar on the table, to go out and suffer. Years ago, I had a job where I worked the night shift, and I would be exhausted when I got home around 7:30 in the morning, and I was living in this big apartment building, and I would make myself walk around the building 3 times, and then I would walk up the stairs rather than take the elevator. In other words, I had an aim to increase my suffering. I also realized at one point I got really frustrated because I just missed a bus. And I realized that this was a perfect opportunity to intentionally suffer. And so I would rush and try and get to a bus stop as quickly as I could. And then I would deliberately stand there and let the bus come, stop, and drive away without me. And I also did this with the subway. I would stand, I would rush to the subway, and I wouldn't allow myself to go through the doors of the first train. I would wait for the next train, for the next bus. This was a deliberate intent. It was an inner exercise for myself to increase my suffering. So to have an aim, to intend, to suffer is the highest form of suffering. So, but if a struggle begins in him, and particularly if there's a definite line in this struggle, then gradually permanent traits begin to form themselves. He begins to crystallize. But crystallization is possible on a right foundation, and it is possible on a wrong foundation. Friction, the struggle between yes and no, can easily take place on a wrong foundation. For instance, a fanatical belief in some or other idea, or the fear of sin, can evoke a terribly intense struggle between yes and no, and a man may crystallize on these foundations. But this would be a wrong, incomplete crystallization. Such a man will not possess the possibility of further development. In order to make further development possible, he must be melted down again, and this can be accomplished only through terrible suffering. Crystallization is possible on any foundation. Take, for example, a brigand, a really good, genuine brigand. I knew such brigands in the Caucasus. He will stand with a rifle behind a stone by the roadside for 8 hours without stirring. Could you do this? All the time, mind you, a struggle is going on in him. He is thirsty and hot. Flies are biting him, but he stands still. Another is a monk. He is afraid of the devil. All night long, he beats his head on the floor and prays. Thus, crystallization is achieved. In such ways, people can generate in themselves an enormous inner strength. They can endure torture. They can get what they want. This means that there is now in them something solid, something permanent. Such people can become immortal. But what is the good of it? A man can become an immortal thing. Although a certain amount of consciousness is sometimes preserved in him, but even in this, it must be remembered, occurs very rarely. And that comes from in search of the miraculous. So suffering involves a friction. My wanting the chocolate bar or wanting to eat the bread and denying myself. But it also involves this conscious awareness of the fact that I'm suffering. And in this quote, he gives a clue as to the power of suffering. We lack individuality. We lack indivisibility. We are a multitude of eyes, a multitude of personas. We change from moment to moment. We're nice, we're upset, we're wonderful, we're this, we're that. We're flipping through eyes all the time, through personas, and we lack any kind of inner unity. And it's through this friction, through intentionally struggling, through the suffering that arises from this intentional suffering, that we begin to develop this inner unity, that we begin to develop something real and solid within ourselves. So rather than setting your life up to avoid suffering, you should be consciously and intentionally setting up your life to increase friction, to increase suffering, knowing that if you suffer with that mindful awareness, if you suffer consciously, that you are growing a solid foundation within you. You are creating permanent things within you, and you no longer are that multiplicity of eyes, that there is something forming. Awakening is only possible for those who seek it and want it, for those who are ready to struggle with themselves and work on themselves for a very long time and very persistently in order to attain it. Here's something else. For a very long time. It doesn't just happen. A week of suffering, a year of suffering, even a decade of suffering. It's something that you've got to start bringing into your life now, knowing that as you suffer now consciously with mindful awareness, you are preparing something for the future. For this, so very persistently in order to attain it, for this it is necessary to destroy buffers. That is, to go out and meet all of those inner sufferings which are connected with the sensation of contradictions. Moreover, the destructions of buffers in itself requires very long work, and a man must agree to this work, realizing that the result of his work will be every possible discomfort and suffering from the awakening of consciousness. So when I talked about buffers, or not buffers, when I talked about the misuse of sexual energy and buffers, and I connected buffers to hiding conscience, I mentioned that 5 years ago, coming up this Lent, I gave myself an exercise. I recorded, and pardon my French, 3 phrases. One is, I am a shithead, my head brain. The other was, I am an asshole, representing my body brain, and I am a scumbag, representing my feeling brain. And I listened to the recording. I spoke these words in my mind. With the head brain, I thought of any time I had said something bad, hurt, was mean, whatever with people. With my body brain, anytime, I jumped into line, or I cut people off in traffic, or I did something physically that was wrong. And with my feeling brain, anytime, with my feelings, maybe I was too selfish or too egotistical or too whatever. And all of these memories began to surface over the 6-week period I did this. And I can't tell you how uncomfortable it was to see myself, to look at myself, to realize all of those inner contradictions. We always maintain this myth that we're a good person and that we do goodness, and our buffers prevent us from seeing the opposite. So suffering for our defects, suffering for the hurt and pain we caused other people, eliminating those buffers, looking at our contradictory actions and seeing how bad we really are is a profound form of suffering. So work on buffers, work on removing buffers, work on remorse of conscience is a profound exercise in intentional suffering, in conscious suffering, setting ourselves up for those experiences. So long as man is not horrified at himself, he knows nothing about himself. But in order to be able to attain this, or at least begin to attain it, a man must die. That is, he must free himself from 1,000 petty attachments and identifications which hold him in the position in which he is. He is attached to everything in his life, attached to his imagination, attached to his stupidity, attached even to his sufferings, possibly his sufferings more than anything else. And here he's talking about mechanical suffering. He must free himself from this attachment to things, identification with things, or attachment to things, identification with things, keep alive 1,000 useless eyes in man. These eyes must die in order that the big I may be born. But how can they be made to die? They do not want to die. It is at this point that the possibility of awakening comes to the rescue. To awaken means to realize one's nothingness. That is, to realize one's complete and absolute mechanicalness and one's complete and absolute helplessness. And it is not sufficient to realize it philosophically in words. It is necessary to realize it in clear, simple, and concrete facts, in one's own facts. And as an aside, a very important exercise in the Gurdjieff teachings is a recapitulation of your life. To Catherine Hulme, Mr. Gurdjieff once gave an exercise and told her to imagine a chair for every year of her life, and to imagine she could see herself at those ages sitting in her chair, and to do a thorough review of herself as objectively as possible, focusing on flaws and various different things. It's a very painful exercise. Anna Butowski, who was actually brought into the Gurdjieff teachings through Uspensky, though she later broke with Uspensky and stayed with Mr. Gurdjieff, was one of the initial 6 members of the St. Petersburg group that Uspensky belonged to. And in her book, with Mr. Gurdjieff in St. Petersburg and Paris, she talks about an exercise of talking about themselves that Mr. Gurdjieff asked them to do. And one of the members of the group was a doctor, and he couldn't see the bad that he did. He couldn't talk about that. And in the book, Mr. Gurdjieff talks about how that exercise was useless for that man, that he just wasn't able to see all of the hurt, all of the pain, all of the toes that he had stepped on, that he had this illusion about himself that he wasn't able to overcome. And part of doing that exercise, that recapitulation, that going back over our life, is to recall our flaws, to recall those bad points, to recall the hurt we caused other people, not to think about all the wonderful things, not to do it like we would be if we were massaging our curriculum vitae, our resume, our CV, and to paint ourselves in the best possible light. The way to do it is objectively and impartially as possible, and to try to see ourselves in the worst possible light. So, and it is not sufficient to realize it philosophically in words. It is necessary to realize it in clear, simple, and concrete facts, in one's own facts. When a man begins to know himself a little, he will see himself in himself many things that are bound to horrify him. So long as man is not horrified at himself, he knows nothing about himself. A man has seen in himself something that horrifies him. He decides to throw it off, stop it, put an end to it. But however many efforts he makes, he feels he cannot do this, that everything remains as it was. Here, he will see his impotence, his helplessness, and his nothingness. Or again, when he begins to know himself, a man sees that he has nothing that is his own. That is, that all that he has regarded as his own, his views, thoughts, convictions, tastes, habits, even faults and vices, all of these are not his own, but have either been formed through imitation or borrowed from somewhere ready-made. In feeling this, a man may feel his nothingness. And in feeling his nothingness, a man should see himself as he really is, not for a second, not for a moment, but constantly, never forgetting. And this involves intentional suffering, conscious laboring and intentional suffering, to realize that we are not this fictional story in our mind, to realize that we have not been nearly as good or as kind or as helpful as we think we are. I've seen people, oh, I'm this and that, I'm a wonderful person, and I have my friend, but I can't stand that person, just flipping without realizing the contradictions in what they're saying. We can use the word hypocrisy, but everyone is a hypocrite. And we've got to suffer for our faults. We've got to look at ourselves objectively to see all of this within ourselves. This continual consciousness of his nothingness, of his helplessness, will eventually give a man the courage to die. That is, to die not merely mentally or in his consciousness, but to die in fact and renounce actually and forever those aspects of himself which are either unnecessary from the point of view of his inner growth or which hinder it. These aspects are first of all his false I, and then all fantastic ideas about his individuality, will, consciousness, capacity to do, his powers, initiative, determination, and so on. To suffer our illusions about ourselves, to see through them, to look at ourselves objectively. Another thing is that people must sacrifice their suffering. And here it seems a little bit contradictory. It is very difficult also to sacrifice one's suffering. A man will renounce any pleasure you like, but he will not give up his suffering. Man is made in such a way that he is never so much attached to anything as he is to his suffering, and we can stick the word mechanical suffering. It is necessary to be free from suffering. No one who is free from suffering, and here he's meaning mechanical suffering, who is not sacrificed to suffering can work. Later on, a great deal must be said about suffering. Nothing can be attained without suffering, but at the same time, one must begin by sacrificing suffering. Now decipher what this means. So we have to sacrifice our suffering, and nothing can be attained by suffering. Of course, this is explained later. And what are they suffering from? A man inwardly requires that everyone should see what a remarkable man he is, and that they should constantly give expression to their respect, esteem, admiration for him, for his intellect, his beauty, his cleverness, his wit, his presence of mind, his originality, and all other qualities. And this is internal considering. We have to sacrifice the suffering that arises from internal considering. You know, wanting people to say how wonderful we are, doing something for praise and wanting to be praised about it. Requirements in their turn that are based on a completely fantastic notion about themselves, such as very often occurs with people of very modest appearance. Various writers, actors, musicians, artists, and politicians, for instance, are almost without exception sick people. And what are they suffering from? First of all, from an extraordinary opinion of themselves, then from requirements, then from considering. That is, being ready and prepared beforehand to take offense at lack of understanding and lack of appreciation. So we do something good for someone and they don't thank us, and we suffer. We step outside and it's raining and we feel like the universe is conspired against us and we suffer. All of this is internal considering. This is all mechanical suffering. This is the egocentric, egotistical suffering. Me, my, mine, look at me, world, look how good I am. And because the world doesn't acknowledge that, we suffer. And this is the suffering that we must give up. And Mr. Gurdjieff said, this is the suffering people are generally and most often refusing to give up. They hold on to this suffering. They hold on to this internal considering. Only the imprints of conscious labor and intentional suffering are real. I must warn you that you cannot attain to such blessings if you insist on clinging to your present joys. Look back on your life and see what good has come to you from past joys. They are useless to you today as the snows of last year which have melted and left no trace by which one can remember what they were. In other words, our normal activity, to use the phrase I love of his, pouring from the empty to the void. Nothing remains. Only the imprints of conscious labor and intentional suffering are real and can be used in the future for obtaining good. Elsewhere, Mr. Gurdjieff said mechanical suffering is useless, but what conscious suffering forever leaves an imprint behind in our being, which is permanent, from intentionally suffering, from conscious labors and intentional suffering. We create this permanence. We create this unity within us. Our indivisible I can only grow on that solid basis. So within Buddhism, nirvana means blowing out of flame, the extinction of the self. Within certain forms of Hinduism, moksha, liberation, is liberation from the pain and suffering of this world. They're seeking to blank themselves out, to disappear into that state of nirvana, to cease to be. They're not consciously working with suffering. They are not consciously creating something real within themselves. Now, there are Buddhist traditions, certain forms of Japanese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, where they've actually evolved beyond the getting rid of suffering, and they do engage in practices of tremendous suffering. And it is through this practice of tremendous suffering consciously that we create the foundation for the growth of our real I, for that degree of indivisibility. Oops, this is repeat. To have your own I, it is necessary for it to be born. Today, you have thousands of eyes. Each weakness is an I that can at any moment make itself your master. To have your own I, it is necessary for it to be born. It has to be conceived, because if you have allowed the work, it has to be conceived because you have allowed the work to enter in you. It will not grow by itself. It must be fed so that it can accumulate substance and one happy day take form. Then it can develop and be born. And just as an aside, all of this inner work leaves a trace, it leaves a residue, it leaves an impression behind within ourselves. We are actually growing something by doing this. This substance of I, of the real I, comes only from intentional suffering. When, for instance, you wish strongly for a cigarette and deny yourself, you will suffer inwardly. Then say, I wish to make this inward force my own force. I wish to receive this substance of my intentional suffering for my own I. By this means, you can become an individual and go on the path that leads to perfected man. This next one, this is one of my favorite all-time quotes. You know, I wish the result of this, my suffering, be my own for being. This is Catherine Hulme, the writer of The Nun's Story, a member of the Ladies of the Rope. She worked intensely with Mr. Gurdjieff in the mid to late 30s. And he always encouraged his students to quit smoking, and she took him up on it. Most of them wouldn't. So Catherine Hulme here, he gave the nickname crocodile, because of her thick skin. And I tell Gurdjieff that in the exercise, I get mixed with my task about cigarettes. Not smoking for a week to see what new flow of associations result. And that I seem for the moment to learn more of myself through cigarette abstinence. Example, I discover I have wild animals. These are buffers. I discover it is very crafty. Never once has even the word cigarette come up in my mind. Imagination never produces a picture of a cigarette. I can look on friends smoking without anything, all while it is suffering for a cigarette. But a very crafty and cunning animal I have, which spends a great craft covering up its desires. So stopping smoking, if you smoke, is tremendous suffering to see these animals, these wild things in you. Oh, go ahead. Oh, it'll just be one. Various different things that are buffers within us that sort of allow us to not see the contradictions and to do things we shouldn't be doing. Gurdjieff, this can be a thing for power. I tell you one very important thing to say each time when longing comes. At first you say, and maybe notice nothing. Second time, maybe nothing. Third time, maybe nothing. Say, I wish that the force of my wishing be my own for being. Then he thinks, no, better another way. Force such as this have special results, make chemicals, have special emanations. Better say, I wish results of this, my suffering, be my own for being. Yes, you can call that kind wishing suffering, because is suffering. This saying can maybe take force from animal and give to being, and can do this for many things, for any denial of something that is slavery. Gurdjieff and the Woman of the Rose. He said that there were very few slaves. Smoking, addiction to drinking, certain forms of addictions are major slaves. And the suffering that we endure when we go through can really have this transformative effect. Particularly if I say, I wish that this suffering be for my being, that we help to grow our being. Suffering. One needs fire. Without fire, there will never be anything. This fire is suffering. In other words, the fusion that melts down all those eyes and develops that indivisible eye. This fire is suffering, voluntary or intentional suffering without which it is impossible to create anything. One must prepare, must know what will make one suffer, and when it is there, make use of it. Only you can prepare. Only you know what makes you suffer, makes the fire that cooks, cements, crystallizes, does. The word to do, or the phrase, the verb to do, does. Suffer by your defects, in your pride, in your egoism. Remind yourself of the aim. Without prepared, that is intentional suffering, there is nothing. For by as much as one is conscious, there is no more suffering. No further process. Nothing. What he's talking about is later on, suffering ceases. That is why with your conscience, you must prepare what is necessary. You owe to nature the food you eat, which nourishes your life. You must pay for these cosmic substances. You have a debt, an obligation to repay by conscious work. Do not eat like an animal, but render to nature for what she has given you. Nature, your mother, a drop, a drop, a drop, accumulating during days, months, years, centuries, perhaps will give results. So we have to do it for a long time. Questioner, when I examine the few years I have been in the work, I notice I have never lacked driving force, but that part of me has always run away from work. I saw this when you told me I lacked physical will. Where can I get the force which will give me physical will? Gurdjieff, only one thing can help you. You must suffer physically. For instance, don't eat enough. Be hungry. Or if your organism doesn't like cold water, make yourself bear cold water. Cold water. Same with hot water. Do the opposite of what your body is in the habit of doing. Make it suffer. And this is not beating yourself with whips and, cutting fingers off. It's not hurting your body, but you make it suffer. It is the one and only way to make the force you lack, not a mental suffering. We have 7 kinds of suffering. For you, bodily suffering is necessary. With your mind, you can mercilessly govern your body, make it suffer. In you, 2 parts work, but the body does not. Have you understood your emotion? If you have observed it, if you believe it, do the struggle. Do this, struggle, suffer. Afterwards, you will be able to work on yourself. I am glad you came to this question by yourself. Now, we're almost out of time. There was a man at the Prieuré. He was a lawyer by the name of Recapitulation. I would recommend, it's available for download, Boyhood with Gurdjieff. Look for it. I believe I have my Journeys with the Mystic on torontogurdjieff.com in the book section. You can download it. One of my favorite passages, they tormented Recapitulation because everyone hated him. And Mr. Gurdjieff is talking to 12, maybe 13, 14-year-old Fritz Peters at this moment. You remember Mr. Gurdjieff said, how I tell you that you make trouble. Fritz Peters made trouble. He caused a lot of friction at the Prieuré. This true, but you only child. Recapitulation, grown man and not mischievous like you, but have such personality that he constantly cause friction, whatever he do, wherever he live. He not make serious trouble, but he make friction on surface of life all the time. He cannot help this. He too old to change now. When I tell you that though Recapitulation is already rich merchant, I pay him to stay here. You are surprised, but this so. He very old friend and very important for my purposes. I cannot pay him what he already makes all by self in tea business in Paris. So when I go to see him and humble myself. And he left. And he said, I'm leaving the prieuré because the children, in particular Fritz Peters, tormented him so much. So when I go see him, I humble myself, have to beg him to make sacrifice for my sake. He agreed to do this. And I now have obligation to him for life. Without Remilovich, prieuré is not sane. I know no one person like him, no person who just by existence, without any conscious effort, produced friction in all the people around him. So he was hired by Mr. Gurdjieff to live and have lunch and dine and be at the prieuré because he rubbed everyone the wrong way. And one of the aphorisms of the prieuré is, you know, you came here only to work on yourself. Be thankful for everyone who gives you the opportunity to do that, for learning how to suffer the displeasing manifestations of others for themselves. I'll probably begin a little bit in the next meeting, open it to questions. If anyone who's watching on Facebook has any questions about suffering or something, I'll discuss this in the next meeting. But suffering, intentional suffering. Try and figure out some place today where you can intentionally suffer. Wonderful exercise is holding your arms out. First, you may only do it for 5 minutes, but get to the point where your whole body is shaking. It was an exercise that Mr. Gurdjieff taught his students. There are other ways of suffering. You know, find something you really want and then not using it. Try to invent your own. Only you know what makes you suffer. At any rate, we are out of time. Thank you, those of you here. Thank you, those of you who are watching on Facebook, and for those of you who are later watching on YouTube. Tremendously important concept. It's related to remorse of conscience, buffers, so many other things. Conscious labors and intentional suffering, to go out and to suffer as a direct result of an intention you set. Okay, I'd like to thank you all
Allan.
today, and
thank you very much.
Take care, and bring some suffering into the rest of the day. You know, put a little pebble in your shoe and go for a walk or something. Bye now.
Bye.